Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Chatting the Pictures. I'm Cara Finnegan. I'm a writer, teacher, and historian of photography.
And I'm Michael Shaw, the publisher of Reading the Pictures. Glad to be with you.
Hello, Michael. How are you this week?
I'm good, Cara. How are you doing?
Once again, you and your team have picked some really great pictures for us to talk about. Should we get started?
Absolutely. There's almost too much to choose from out there. I was just reflecting that years ago, and that means before the Trump era, there was if we were in June after Memorial Day, we'd be hard pressed to find anything that salient visually to talk about. Shark attacks and all of that. But it seems that not only is that not the case, but there's a urgency to so many different kinds of issues and related imagery. It is, even at this time of year, very difficult to choose particular images to talk about. So, but we did find three.
Yeah. There are many, many more that we could certainly have selected as well for this week. So this is the first image of the week. Michael, why don't you give us the full photo caption?
Sure. And in fact, this photo gives us a chance to talk about something briefly that we hardly ever talk about, which is the caption and the breadth of the caption, and to the extent to which a caption can also not just flesh out a story, but also do some editorializing or commentary. So John Moore from Getty has been shooting the border for years, and he has a book out right now, and he's really been very, very committed to this story. His images are really brilliant. Also, but he did like a two-sentence caption on Instagram talking about this woman, this little girl being a Honduran asylum seeker, 2 years old, her mother being taken into custody near the U.S.-Mexico border. And then he has another line about the Trump administration's zero-tolerance policy for undocumented immigrants, calling for the separation of parents and children. In a fuller caption that Getty circulated, he locates the scene to McAllen, Texas, near the border, mentions that the mother and child with a group of others had rafted across the Rio Grande, and then he goes on to talk about not just that zero tolerance policy, but there's a final line that says, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions also said that domestic and gang violence in immigrants, the country of origin, would no longer qualify them for political and asylum status. So then at this point, and he sets up our discussion, he also brings in the whole issue about domestic violence and the whole issue of, as well as the issue of political asylum. So I have many thoughts, but why don't, Carol, what are you seeing here just right off the bat?
Yeah, I'm really glad you shared those, the captions, particularly the broader ones that contextualize the issue, because I think particularly with this issue and with news imagery in general, it's really important to kind of maintain that balance between extracting what we can extract from the picture visually and really trying to understand the broader context in which it's happening. So, and I think these two things are related because as it's become more visible to a broader segment of the public what's been happening at the border, people have started to ask more questions and people have started to want to understand more about the context. So I think those two things are definitely related. When we've done these Chatting the Pictures events in the past, we've had a few other images where we've had an image of a child where there are adults that are either absent entirely. I'm thinking of images we talked about from Syria, or in the case of this one, we only have the lower bodies of the adults. And so clearly more wants us to focus on the child in this context. But it is the child in relation to what's happening with the adults. So clearly we're drawn to the emotion on the face of the child, and we're being invited by the way that the child is centered in the photo, and also by the clothing of the child, that bright red. We're
GOP
being,
red.
yeah, we're being invited to really identify with the child, and we're essentially looking at the child who is looking up at the adults, and particularly appears to be looking at what I presume is the person who is rear end is facing us, the viewer, the law enforcement officer, who appears to be hands in pockets searching the mother. I'm not sure if that's how you interpret it, but I interpret it as this is someone with gloves on their hands who are, who's
Hands on.
physically searching this child's mother. And so this is a very intense scene. It's a very anxiety-filled scene. And I think because of the way Moore composes the photo, he's really inviting us to not only think about the child and the children more broadly, but also to kind of, along with the child, have a kind of anguished asking of questions, I guess. The child seems to be looking up, not only anxious or worried, but also just questioning what is happening. This is a child that is a small child, and she does not know what's happening. It's heartbreaking.
It is a photo that really, it's a conscience photo times 10. I mean, it really is saying that people are not paying attention to this child. People are otherwise I'm not sure the word, but like kind of not consumed, but like otherwise detained.
Yeah,
and,
or engaged, right? Yeah.
And so it's left to us to do something about it, or to, to take, to take responsibility for what's happening with this kid right now. It's very, very effective and pretty straightforward. But and one thing that's really interesting to me about the photo is how it does feel gendered also. I mean, you don't know whether it's a man or woman officer, border patrol officer, but the way that the officer has the left hand on the woman, and especially when we know too that the administration has now changed the precluded gender discrimination or sexual abuse from an asylum justification. It starts to feel like, the man, whether you think about the man as a metaphor for the state, or actually is a man, you start to feel in a subconscious way, a kind of perhaps active violation here. And it caused me to go back and look at the full Getty edit. And there are at least in the package, maybe there's 20 photos from this one particular event. And I think there's probably like 4 or 5 pictures of this particular mother and child. And I'm pretty sure, in fact, the Border Patrol officer is a woman. But the fact then that I would have been so sure that it wasn't makes me also think about, how much the Trump administration is populated by men and white males, and there's such a skew also in terms of really this kind of macho attitude. So that's another aspect of this.
Yeah, I noticed the photo too also puts us, you mentioned that that person that officer is a representative of the state. That person represents all of us, and the fact that Moore places the viewer in a position of sympathy with the child, but also literally kind of on the side of the government. In other words, we are visually aligned with that officer who is on our side of the photo. That, I think, also ties up, it really raises the moral implications that a lot of people have, especially this week, been addressing. Where are we, quote unquote, Americans, quote unquote, in this context, and what are we doing about it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Shall we move on to the next image?
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of the state.
Or multiple states, or states of ambiguity.
Yeah.
The caption reads, "A document being exchanged between U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and North Korea leader's sister, Kim Jong Un, moments after it was signed." So family affair too. One thing, while we're talking about like some technical details, whether we're talking about the role of the caption, in this case, what's fabulous about this photo, and I would bet we're never going to see a better example, is how you can read it in layers. Often, we read photos in terms of rule of thirds, and we're looking at it in terms of how one side of the photo might speak to the other side of the photo. But in this case, you can read this thing front to back, and I see 5 distinct layers. You have the table with that flower arrangement, which is, really in a way just plopped there and seems to divide these two. You have the 2 leaders. Then the way this photo is cropped is really interesting because on the third pass or the middle section, you have the 2 flags, and the American flags are kind of cropped out. So this, and maybe editorializing again, feels like North Korea, has like is carrying more weight or has more prominence. Mm-hmm. Then you get the Pompeo, Kim Jong Un layer with like bursting with pride and seeming importance around this document that really had like nothing in it. And then you have the door, which is entrance and exit. So I just love the fact that you've got, all of these layers, talking to each other.
That's really smart. I was thinking kind of 3 layers or 3 sets of interactions. And the fact that you identified 2 more is really cool. I love that. Yeah. And I think because of the way the photo is layered in that way that you just really wonderfully described, it's you really see the contrast, the affective or the emotional contrast between Trump and Un in the front, and then the representatives who appear to be doing the official business. But again, that document's pretty thin, and most people talked about how it was very thin, and we know that it didn't really do very much in the context of North Korean concessions. And so to me, it's the contrast of the bodies and the faces. So in the background, you've got the official sort of pleasant smiling, you've got the interaction with the document, the handoff, if you will, the handshaking or whatever will come after that. And then in the foreground, you've got just completely different faces. And then within that foreground, 2 completely different faces. You've got, the North Korean leader. I don't know how you would describe that face. I describe it as, questioning, suspicious, but also sort of blank. And then Trump is blank in a completely different way, almost just a little bit deer in the headlights, and also a little bit just kind of nothing face. I don't know what you make of the facial expressions that this photographer's caught, but to me, they're really striking in their contrast, especially with the people in the background who are all like doing the appropriate handshaking and smile. They're doing the ritualized behavior. And in the front, there's like no ritualized behavior happening at all.
Yeah, and maybe there was no ritualized behavior that was happening in this summit at all. But if you followed our Twitter feed this week, we did dozens and dozens of photos from the summit. And then also on our site, a little bit of a plug. We have a post we put up yesterday written by Marta Zarzika titled From the Olympics to Singapore, Kim Jong Un's Remarkable Visual Makeover. And what the post does is really chronicle his brilliance, this acumen he's had, visual acumen, starting from the Olympics, where he has not made a false move and has just been incredible in terms of how he's positioned himself. And so to me, I think I was waiting for anticipating the summit as kind of the Ali Frazier to see, how this was going to play out, with Trump bombastic and already like narrating success all the time, with, Kim's ability to really, to work himself, into like this, certainly in this summit, this kind of, new level of acceptability and parity on the world stage. So this photo did not circulate nearly as much as all of like the really standard ones, but I think it's brilliant because one thing that Trump emphasized before, during, and after is that, he has the ability to sum up somebody else. And he even said specifically that, he was looking, he was going to be looking Kim in the eyes. And if you look at almost every photo that went out, you see photos of him looking directly at Kim, and half of the time or more, Kim's just ignoring Trump's gaze and looking directly at the camera. So looking at the world, and it's so striking and obvious to me over and over again. So what I love about this photo is, as opposed to this kind of connection, what you get is Kim gets to, like, you know, really give Trump the once over, and he's got that space to do it and to operate in that. And you've got Trump clueless, you know, just waiting for his next, you know, assumption to kick in or something. So I think that it's just brilliant. I think it's brilliant on that layer, just in terms of the dynamic between the two visually.
You wonder if a photo, you know, 20 years from now, when people are writing about this political event, whether this will be a photo that will stand out maybe in a different way than, you know, the hand on the back and a lot of the other ones, as you pointed out, that you took up this week and that we've seen in the media more generally. But yeah, fascinating. And also, I think just an example of political stagecraft that does not appear to have had anything behind it other than this kind of visual recuperation of Kim Jong Un, which I think is really interesting. I really encourage people to go look at that piece on the site. It's really smart.
Yeah, I do think that the two flags, the fact that the editor cropped out the two American flags, is also telling. It's just, and maybe that's completely unintentional, but I really think that Kim owned this summit and owned Trump, and the fact that you get the two DPRK flags and the American flags are kind of crowded out it just says a lot to me.
Yeah.
Especially, and also Pompeo, and also Pompeo being so, you know, excited about, you know, this document, this fetishization of this piece of paper when it has nothing on it. Anyway, and I'm
imagining, right, like you could just to kind of extend that point one bit further, one can imagine you could make a whole lot of memes by replacing that document with something else.
And I know they're out there. I'm sure they're out there.
Yeah, there must be. Or maybe we will now inspire our viewers to do that. So here's our last image for this week. Why don't you give us the caption?
Mariah Parker takes her oath of office for County Commissioner District 2 with her hand on the autobiography of Malcolm X, and her mother, Maddie Parker, by her side on the steps of City Hall in downtown Athens, Georgia, Tuesday, June 5th, 2018. Parker filled the county commissioner's seat, vacated by Harry Sims, who left his seat to run for mayor. She won the election for District 2 by 13 votes. And the photo is by Joshua Jones, the Athens Banner-Herald. Local photographers.
Yeah. 2 thumbs up for local photographers. This photo, I think, following on the heels of the one we just talked about, is really interesting because it's also activating a lot of symbols and doing so in really interesting ways. And to me, I think the biggest contrast in terms of the photo and its context, which is this this woman's election to a county commissioner's seat in Athens, Clarke County. The biggest contrast is the symbolism that she is embodying, the ideas she's embodying with the Black Power fist, the putting the hand on the Malcolm X autobiography, and then you know, her afro, her youth, all of these things. To me, are this kind of marvelous contrast with this really conventional moment where she has been elected to be a county commissioner. And I don't know how much time you all spend hanging around in your local government, but county commissioners, right, and people who work in various, you know, local elected offices work really hard. They don't get a lot of love and affection and money, and they are people who are really committed to their local communities. But it is not dramatic, sexy, 5 million people, Women's March on Washington kind of stuff. And so, I think the photo has play visually because it's like, oh, look at this strong young Black woman. Wow, she's activating some symbols that are pretty controversial to some people. But to me, what I love about it is it's just all of that is happening in this totally conventional moment, right? Where she's even got her proud mom next to her, as this family support, this candidate taking oath conventional thing. And so to me, all of that together is what really embodies what's interesting about this photo, because it's a photo of a moment where people really are beginning to move. Younger people, women, people of color are beginning to move into really traditional mainstream zones of power. And I think that's just really fascinating. And this photo really nicely encapsulates that for me.
Yeah, that's a really interesting take, and it makes me think about how much media activists and foundations are really concerned about what's happening with local media, local newspapers, and this real concern, in contrast to the adage that all politics is local, that all politics has become national and very much personality driven. And it's funny, we get so hung up ourselves on these cultural tropes and how this reminds at least people of my generation of Angela Davis, and this kind of almost a nostalgia for the movement and the yippies and there is a nostalgia also for the Black Panther movement. But this is grassroots. This is all politics is local, and to express this kind of personality and for a photo like this to really find its way to the national stage through those tropes is, yes, you're right, really talking about that, this same push you get from the Parkland kids and from, and it's not just on the left, but it's about, we have to take back our politics. This is what the Trump insurgency and the Sanders insurgency was all about, was this. So actually, I think it's a really heartening image and success.
Yeah, and it's also interesting too. So I did a little digging. Athens, Georgia is college town, home of University of Georgia, and so it is very much a very blue town in the midst of a very red space. If we're talking about electoral politics, and Maddie Parker is a doctoral student at the University of Georgia. She's a hip hop artist. She's an activist. She has worked on some campaigns, I think, locally. In the little bit of the research I did. So there's also there's an interesting component here of the way that people get involved in politics and their commitments. So she definitely appears to be somebody who ran on a platform of intersectionality, which I think, again, is very much tied to the way that a lot of younger people who are going into mainstream politics are talking and are invested in working right now. I also think it's interesting because, again, just to challenge a little bit about maybe our assumptions about geography or place or space, the person she beat in this race is also a young African-American guy, a former Arena Football League player who is from a family of local political activists. His grandmother was a well-known political activist. This guy's name is Taylor Pass. So there too, it's interesting that it was a close race. That these are both two people under 30, African-American people in their community who are interested in serving in their local government. And having that as a context, I think also reminds us that local politics is often the place where people really do have to interact and have to talk to each other and have to cooperate and
make it work.
You can't necessarily avoid your political opponents, right, in the way that maybe people can or we think people can at the national level. So to me, that's also really interesting. There's potentially, I don't know the details of this race, but potentially there's some kind of town and gown things happening there too, where you have this, uh, um, you know, uh, you have this particular candidate who now will be bringing the concerns of um, maybe a number of groups of people, intersectional groups, who haven't necessarily felt welcome in local government before.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot about this photo. As I said, to me, the core really is just that connection between the symbolism of the movements as they're playing out intersectionally now, and the really conventional spaces where people are choosing to make themselves, get themselves engaged.
And to bust out of the frame for a second, and maybe like this is like a big semiotic stretch, but now I'm thinking about this picture in the way it might potentially dialogue with the last one, where you do have the daughter, the mother, the representative of the state or the first one, I'm sorry, the first photo. So, I mean, you got to be careful about drawing the comparisons too closely, but, you do have people that have been, disenfranchised by America that don't look like Americans. And of course, if these are asylum seekers, they're potential Americans. But, again, in the last photo, it feels like, the American contract made good. And here you have from disenfranchisement or people that aspire to be part of America, and that's different than Trump's proposal for qualification for citizenship, which is like best and brightest, and is just going to be cherry picking from the international community. Here, this is, I would imagine, someone who grew up, with these kind of aspirations, and it comes to pass, and that we do have a more pluralistic society, and we do have and people remain intact in terms of the American family. And I just, the more I look at this, and especially in the context of that first image and all the horrible scenes that we're seeing right now of disenfranchisement, this, I just, I love that you can just see the sleeve of this guy, of the judge or whoever it is, and then it goes on from there. So this makes me really happy.
Yeah, I agree. And that's really interesting to think about the contrast between the first and the last photo. I hadn't made that connection, but I think you're right. And we also then have to acknowledge, right, that these are things that are happening simultaneously. That one is not necessarily the answer to the other, at least not in this moment, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's a lot of progressive and retrograde things happening at the same time in our society, and I think that's why we're all on such pins and needles.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
well,
so lots of stuff again this week.
Lots of stuff again. I want to thank everyone for watching. If you like what we're doing, follow us on Twitter and Instagram for our microanalysis. Follow us on readingthepictures.org. Sign up for our Week in Review newsletter. We are trying to do these programs on as many Saturdays as possible. We also welcome your feedback, especially on our Facebook page where we're streaming live right now. And we hope to see you again next week. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Cara.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.